This is a Black Talk Radio news segment with Scotty Reed. And this is a new segment that I will start producing on fake news in the black community. There are a lot of things that are circulated among the black community, especially online. It always seems to come from the same people. Usually they cannot provide any sources of their information. And so there's a big problem with fake news being circulated in the black community concerning issues or the history of black people, quote unquote, African Americans. So as you can see there from the graphic, the first fake news segment will be on the question of whether or not the U.S. Constitution considers black people, quote unquote, to be 3/5 human. So this is our first fake news watch segment. If you have any fake news or what you suspect to be fake news for me to address in future videos, please send those to info@blacktalkradionetwork.com. I'll get it. Again, that's info@blacktalkradionetwork.com. Now, where does this originate from is what I mean to say. Where does this ideal that the United States Constitution considers black people to be 3/5 human come from? Well, it actually does have its roots in history, and it's rooted in what is known as the 3/5 compromise. What the 3/5 compromise was about was the apportionment of representatives in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, based on the population. So those states that had a higher population count would have more representation from that state in the Congress. And so the southern states, which were engaged heavily in enslaving Africans and not just importing them, but breeding them like cattle. That's why it's called chattel slavery. They were property. And so they would explode the population. In many of these southern states, the population of the enslaved would be far more than the population of free persons. And when added together, of course, that would give them a higher number of representation, as slavery was not as widely practiced in northern states. And in the western states, I don't think we actually had western states when this was the question. But yeah, northern states were not widely practicing slavery like it was being practiced in the South. So the South had an advantage. Now, let's go to the internet and, just Google this question. There is absolutely, in my mind, no reason for anybody to be ignorant in the information age, especially if they have access to the internet. That does not mean you believe the first thing that you pull up, but you research it and you compare it to other sources. Now, so I'm going to point you to a source that I pulled up. Let me pull up the name of this source so you can check it yourself. It's constitution.laws.com, and it's 3/5 compromise. So that's where you want to go to. So let me just read a little bit from this article. Give me just a second as I work to minimize my screen. Okay. So this is how it reads about the 3/5 compromise. It gives you the history. Bear with me as I read it. The proposal for apportionment for the determination of each state's number of seats in the House of Representatives became an issue when the Constitution was being drafted in 1787. Aside from being a complex system and method for calculating the population through the census and then establishing a number of seats for representation, the issue as to who was eligible to be counted for the population was a topic of controversy, which I hinted at when I talked about the southern states counting their victims of slavery. However, it is no surprise that this agreement is known as the 3/5 compromise, for the Constitution itself was born out of compromise between the framers of the Constitution. However, the 3/5 compromise is arguably the most controversial topic, for it delegates that all slaves of a particular state are to be counted as 3/5 of a white person. The population of slaves would be counted as 3/5 in total when apportioning representatives as well as presidential electors and taxes. Now, let me stop right there. Here is a question for further research. Here is a question for constitutional scholars. Now, I kind of hesitated there when they said that the slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a white person. But that is not exactly true. See, this is why it's important to read a lot so that you get different sources of information, so that when you come across something that doesn't sound right, then you will be alerted. Your mind will alert you to that. Now, I'm going to continue to read this, but I'm going to revisit that because it also will be a good segue into another question. All right, or another point I would like to make. So it goes on to read that, let me see, the 3/5 compromise was proposed by, no, let me back up. The population of slaves will be counted as 3/5 in total when apportioning representatives as well as presidential electors and taxes. The 3/5 compromise was proposed by James Wilson and Roger Sherman, who were both delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. However, the 3/5 compromise has its roots further back in history, dating back to the Continental Congress in 1783. The compromise was a result of the apportionment of taxes being related to land values. Initially, taxes were levied not in accordance to the population numbers, but the actual value of the land. Many states began to depreciate the value of the land in order to provide for relief from their taxes. So again, this is what actually, I'm not going to say led to the United States Revolution, but the slavers and landowners who hijacked the American Revolution, that's what they were complaining about, paying taxes. That's what it was all about for them. It wasn't about freedom or liberty or anything. They wanted freedom and liberty to not pay the British king his taxes for having all these British troops protecting them from Native Americans and also from the rebellions of enslaved Africans. So it's all about getting out of taxes for these wealthy people. It has always been so. They do not ever want to pay their fair share of taxes for the common good of a nation. And we see that even today. So let me continue. Initially, taxes were levied not in accordance to the population numbers, but the actual value of the land. Many states began to depreciate the value of the land in order to provide for relief from their taxes. A committee was held that would rectify the situation by implementing the apportionment of taxes in relation to the state's population. However, this ideal was met with the dispute over how to consider slaves in the apportionment process and the actual ratio of slaves to free people at that time. For the most part, those who opposed slavery only wanted to consider the free people of a population. Again, this is for representation and the apportionment of taxes, while those in favor wanted to include slaves in the population count. This will provide for slaveholders to have many more seats in the House of Representatives and more representation in the Electoral College. Many ratios were considered, such as 3/4, 1/2, and 1/4. After much debate, it would be James Madison that would suggest the 3/5 compromise. However, now this is very key right here. However, the 3/5 compromise would not be adopted until the Constitutional Convention because the compromise was not approved by all other states and the Articles of Federation required a unanimous vote. The implementation of the 3/5 compromise would greatly increase the representation and political power of slave-owning states. The southern states, if represented equally, would have accounted for 33 of the seats in the House of Representatives. However, because of the 3/5 compromise, the southern states accounted for 47 seats in the House of Representation, representatives of the United States Congress of 1790. This would allow for the South to garner enough power at the political level, giving them control in presidential elections. A side note here, when you hear these traitors and insurrectionists who talk about the Confederate States of America, talking about they were being oppressed and they rose up because the North had more power than them and so forth and so on, that's a complete lie. That they have more power in Congress than any of the other states, all right? And they didn't want to give up that power, all right? So it goes on to say, this would allow for the South to garner enough power at the political level, giving them control in presidential elections. However, as time moved forward, the 3/5 compromise would not provide the advantage for which the Southern states and slave owners had hoped. The northern states grew more rapidly in terms of population than the South. This would be because of immigration, European immigration to be specific. All right, so it goes on to say, even though southern states had essentially dominated all political platforms prior to the Civil War, afterward that control would be relinquished slowly but surely. It would not be until the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was be enacted in 1865 that the 3/5 compromise would be rendered obsolete. So the 3/5 compromise is not in the United States Constitution whatsoever, and they say that at the end or the conclusion of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed that then just made it obsolete, because now nobody could be legally held as an enslaved person unless they were first convicted of a crime. They were then, through the 14th Amendment, classified as citizens of the United States. I'm talking about the formerly enslaved Africans. So they were granted citizenships to the United States, and therefore they will be counted as one person or a whole person. So meaning that in the United States Census going forward, everybody will be counted as one person, and the apportionment of representation in Congress would be based on the population numbers. All right, now here is the thing. 13th Amendment, as I just hinted at, did not abolish slavery, and I would say that the southern states are still counting modern day slaves as part of their population numbers. Now, here is something we know about the U.S. Census, which we'll be having another one in 2020, the last one being 2010, that the resources that you get back, or really the taxes that you get back from the federal government in terms of block grants and things of that nature, money for infrastructure or any kind of programs that benefit citizens, again, is delegated not just by state, but by county. And in the age of modern day slavery, as prescribed by the 13th Amendment, many black citizens, when they are thrown into slavery upon conviction of a crime, doesn't mean they were guilty, they are sent to prison plantations that are in predominantly white counties. In the census, they are not counted as a person in the counties that they may have lived in prior to their new enslavement. They are counted in the county that prison is located. So those tax dollars that would be allocated to that county that they came from would now be apportioned or delegated to the counties that they are living in on a prison plantation. So another thing is, even prior to the Civil War, people, and I blame this on the miseducation system, and I also blame it on our own ignorance. We in the black community, or was termed as the black community, do not recognize that there were hundreds of thousands of free black people who have lived in the United States going all the way back to colonial times. And we just assume that every black person, every African descended person is a descendant of enslaved Africans. Not that that is anything to be ashamed of, so do not get me wrong. But all of the Afro-descendant people, and I'm going to limit it to quote unquote African Americans, not to black people who are immigrants here from the Caribbean or even from Africa itself. No, I'm just talking about people who are descendants of African Americans. All of us are not descendants of enslaved Africans, and there were hundreds of thousands, and you can look this information up in the census. And therefore, them being citizens, even if they weren't given the full rights and privileges of white citizens because of racism, institutional racism, they were still counted in the census as a whole person, as one person. So we are going to rate the 3/5 compromise order statement that quote unquote black people were considered in the United States Constitution to be 3/5 human as fake news, as bad information. First of all, the 3/5 compromise, which we just laid out for you from that article, they laid it out. It was about taxation. It was about representation. Okay. But free black citizens were being counted. So to say that black people were ever counted 3/5 human is to accept the fake news that all black people in this country or all African Americans are descendants of slaves. No, the 3/5 compromise only dealt with enslaved Africans, not free. So again, we have to call that fake news in the black community. So if you have anything else or any fake news or information that you come across and you're not sure about and you would like me to address it in future segments, again, send it to me at info@blacktalkradionetwork.com. I will look into it. I will do some research and I will present the information to you to the best of my ability. Support independent media by making a donation today to the nonprofit Black Talk Media Project. You can find us online at blacktalkmediaproject.org. Visit our network home at blacktalkradionetwork.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Black Talk Radio Network, and Twitter at Black Talk Radio.